So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me on this episode of Still Brothers. In this program, I have conversations with my atheist brother, Forrest, who runs the channel Latter-day Skeptic. His channel focuses on critiques of the church and religious belief generally. In the end, we may disagree, but we recognize that we are still brothers. And I think that is the secret ingredient for navigating faith differences. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. Tonight, I am joined by my brother, Forrest Hansen. Forrest, how you doing, man?
Doing good. Excited for this.
Yeah,
it's one of those things that we do this stuff all the time as is, and it's about time that we actually just put a camera in front of us and actually record it.
Yeah, it's funny. We have a habit in our family of having these kinds of discussions, and our goal tonight in this inaugural episode of us doing this is to explore some of these ideas together, to try our best to steelman one another's positions, and then kind of compare and contrast the differences in our perspectives. And Forrest puts out content on his channel, Latter-day Skeptic, and I put out content on my channel, Thoughtful Faith. And so you got two brothers with very different perspectives on things, and we're going to dig into kind of basically what we've talked about doing is sort of in every episode we'll take either myself taking sort of the critic's position of something that Forrest has said on his channel, and he has to be sort of the apologist for his own position, or it'll be the opposite, where I will defend maybe something that I have on one of my videos while he offers some critique of that. So that's kind of the way that we're going to roll. And in this first episode, we're going to actually, Forrest is going to be playing the role of the critic, offering some thoughts or critique on some of the stuff that I've said in one of my videos. And so we'll dig right into it. So Forrest, you want to just kind of summarize where we're going with this one?
Yeah, so the first video I wanted to dig in was you did like a little 4-part series on morality. And there's 2 clips in there that I really want to dig into. I don't know if you want to play the first clip or if you want me to steelman kind of the overarching premise first.
Let's play the clip first that you want to play, and I believe it was on part 4, starting at about 9 minutes 9 seconds.
Actually, for this one, I'm gonna because I just want to give like an overall argument of what your moral framework looks like, and then we can dive into each. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because luckily for me, you actually have like an actual argument written out, so it should be we should agree on it pretty quick.
Cool.
It was basically, you had 2 premises that there is an objective standard, and that objective standard is well-being. So that's the first premise. The second premise is ought is the language that we use in relation to well-being on the direction you need to go in order to achieve the desired goal, which for everybody is well-being.
Yeah, essentially the idea here is that being and well-being are objective phenomena in the world, right? Like suffering and then its opposite, which I'll call well-being. This is all kind of, a lot of people who know Sam Harris will be familiar with this kind of stuff. It's sort of like, this is part of the objective reality that we inhabit. Like you put your hand on a stove, it burns you. The experience exists in the universe, okay? And that is the basis of moral judgments. We will say that something is immoral if it moves us farther away from well-being in some ultimate sense, not necessarily, I may pass through suffering to get a greater reward later. That's the concept of sacrifice, which we all do. So it isn't that quote unquote suffering is bad. Some people caricature my argument as though I'm saying all suffering is bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that sacrifice and suffering are 2 different concepts, and that all of us share the exact same goal, right? Which is the highest level of our well-being that we can achieve, which we would call what I call ultimate well-being. And all of our actions ultimately are towards that end. And moral language, as you were discussing, is language that we use to describe movement towards that goal. So I'll say, Forrest, you should do X because I assume that you are a sane creature that wants to move towards the goal that all sane creatures want to move towards, which is their ultimate well-being. And so that's sort of the overall thing. So I think that was kind of what you were going at there.
Yeah, and I kind of baked in the conclusion there. Basically, there is an objective morality, therefore there is an objective morality, and moral language is the language we use talking about a person's actions in reference to the objective.
Yes.
Yes. So that's just kind of like that's the framework I'm going to be talking about in basically both the clips. So we can start the first one.
Okay, let me pull it up here and get it rolling. Moral truth. These are expressions of value. So does this mean that morality is relative or subjective because what we value varies from person to person? No, because we all ultimately value the same thing above all else. We desire to escape suffering. In fact, this is the very bedrock of all moral reasoning and language, as I have explained in my previous videos. We all want to get as far away from suffering as possible and approach some notion of ultimate well-being. The question becomes, how do we get there? The way we arrange the hierarchy of values is an expression of the roadmap we implicitly build for how we reach that end. Everyone, whether explicitly or implicitly, does this because it is requisite to act in the world. The only question is if one's hierarchy of values is properly calibrated towards ultimate well-being. And the nature of well-being and our desire to find it is the subject at the heart of our deepest existential longings and debates. Okay, so give me your thoughts on some of that.
I chose that clip, honestly, just a little bit of a summary because it's at the tail end of the whole argument. And the reason I chose the very end is I want to talk first about the whole concept that you presented and how I believe you're being inconsistent with that moral framework and the way you discuss morality in a lot of other videos. Okay. So what I'm getting at is, do you believe that without God, you can have an objective moral framework?
So, yes, that's actually a question that I've had to wrestle with as well. And I think it's a bit of a semantic point that I kind of struggle with.
The reason this whole thing's about to be funny, by the way, and we've talked about this in the past, I should be the one that really wants to have an objective moral framework without God, and you should be the one that doesn't like that, and we're actually going to argue each other's points here. But I'm arguing just for a consistency because it seems like in that whole series, you laid out there is an objective moral standard, and the big difference is that your ultimate well-being is defined on an eternal scale.
Yes. So this is the way. Yes, and I'm going to put this out there as something that maybe I'm still figuring out. Okay, so I'm going to caveat this a little bit.
And I guess we should caveat the whole conversation of all of these is ideally this is something we're always trying to figure out.
Yeah,
and we have more confidence in something, so I get it that a moral framework isn't...
I guess I'll say this, that yes, suffering exists whether or not you believe in God, obviously. And sane, sentient, rational creatures and the language that we use to describe moral, if something is moral or not, has relationship to that. None of that changes whether or not there is a God. The difference is that the concept of well-being, if being is something that only exists on a 80-year timeline, rather than you will always exist, are two different things. Now, and there's another angle, not just the time side of it. The other angle of this that's super important to keep in mind is that well-being as this sort of polar north star of if something is moral or not moral in an 80-year timeline in a mortal world, it's sort of like you can get away with stuff. Like the morality that emerges from an 80-year existence rationally, logically, what logically follows from it is far different than if I'm accountable for every action that I do. For instance, if I go and hurt someone in this life, maybe I get away with it in this life. And I actually increase my well-being by enslaving another person. So, but in the eternities, I'm accountable to that.
This is like the first problem that I'm going to be addressing. And this whole first problem that I'm addressing is just talking about the standard. It's not talking about how we get there. It's not talking about what emerges. It's just talking about, it's basically saying, are atheists allowed to, is it rational for atheists to talk about morality? Do they have any way that they can rationally do that? Because in a lot of videos, I've heard you, I think in the recent video with Chris Hanna, you had basically said, anytime an atheist talks about morality, you laugh. But it seems like you've provided a perfect way.
I would put it this way. If they talk about morality in the same sort of a frame that I talk about morality, I do believe that it is possible for them to utilize moral language, but the morality that emerges from it is not a morality that would in any way mirror my moral framework.
The whole thing mirrors. The only part that doesn't mirror is what ultimate well-being looks like. There's still perfectly good answers to should you kill your neighbor for no good reason. It seems like there's a lot of really good answers without ultimate or without heaven.
The thing is,
no, that'd be a bad idea. You're going to end up in prison, and you're going to be really upset, and your life's going to be horrible. Yeah, but the thing is,
on that same moral framework, you could say, well, if you can get away with it, you should do it.
Well, not necessarily. Well, again, I actually have heard.
So
we have a conscience, for example.
I think
even if you can get away with things, can you get away with it to yourself? This is actually a point that Jordan Peterson brings up a lot. And I think it's in Brothers Karamazov. Like the whole point is you have a conscience, and that is something you can't get away from, even if you can get away with things. You might be able to socially get away with things, but can you get away from your own conscience?
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying here, to kind of steelman your critique here, is that even if someone gets away with something, we have these, I think Hume even might have spoke of them as our moral sentiments, and you can't get away with those. They're just inbred in you, and you will never find well-being in doing certain things that are wrong because they just affect your well-being. If you go and abuse a child, like you're never going to feel good about that.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, but I do want to kind of keep steering us back to, all I'm saying is there are possibilities for how you can talk, like these are debates that can be had in an atheist worldview about how morality could emerge or how you should act in the world.
So let me grant a point that I think that you have right here. Can an atheist have a moral system that is objectively based in well-being and suffering along an 80-year timeline? Yes, I concede it 100%. This is what I mean when I'm talking about like the word morality and objective, like moral standards, right and wrong answers to questions. Are there right and wrong questions to morality? I think an atheist can, if they embrace this kind of Sam Harris worldview, they can talk about it in that way. Okay, so I'll concede that point.
Well, do they even need to embrace it? If you think
real quick, hold on. Let me just get to this one point, because this is the other side of it. This is where the part that I don't concede is that when people talk about morality, they have a certain image of what morality is in their head. There are things like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and so they're thinking, well, I can embrace the same sort of moral principles coherently that you religious people embrace and still be an atheist. My point is that the morality that actually logically follows from well-being as the standard, if you only exist forever and if there's no such thing as ultimate justice, is not a morality that anyone would recognize, or that what they mean when they're talking about morality.
See, but that's what my point was about the conscience. Like, there's very long, good discussions that we could have about what do we actually, if we followed that train of thought of, if we just live in an 80-year timeline and we believe that that well-being is the ultimate goal, what would emerge? And you're going to get a lot of, I think, very useful, good debates, and I don't think any of them are laughable or not legitimate. It's not like, oh, you're just not a serious atheist because you think that there is even a possibility that we could have morality.
So I was going to pull up something. I thought I had more slides on this. I'm going to actually remove this away. Because there is a... let me actually bring something up. Okay. I'm going to pull up something on the screen here. That I believe can help us with this. So this sort of a notion of the highest value here being well-being, okay, specifically generally references generally we're talking about human well-being, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I typically am, but there's definitely a big push even in the atheist community to non-human animals is what you refer. Wait, what is that? Non-human animals. Basically, animals are starting to
creatures that can feel pain, right?
Like I actually think that in 100 years they'll look back on us eating animals, and that'll be you'll get canceled for watching this video because we're not vegans.
Exactly. So that's fine. So I'm going to stick to humanism specifically.
Okay.
I'm not going to go to the broader conceptions here because I kind of have this worldview flow chart that I've talked about. If there is no God, I think, Forrest, for you tend to fall into the secular humanist movement generally, that you are very much concerned with human well-being. But I want to talk for a minute about humanism just generally, because as I see it, humanism kind of has to break up into two different camps. Okay. Either a person because we talk about well-being, we're talking about it in the ether, right? My thing is we have to get concrete, like whose well-being ultimately takes priority, mine or everybody's, right? And the thing is so the people who tend to look at human beings in terms of, the collective is the ultimate, the well-being, the most good for the most people, kind of the utilitarian view. You're trying to create well-being for as many people, and the individual can be sacrificed to the collective. That's what I call collective humanism, right? Then I have, and you'll find thinkers, I think, like Marx and Gentile, who is the fascist kind of founding father. They were very much of the mindset of the collective humanist. That's sort of the school of thought. On the other hand, you have the individualist humanist who believes in human well-being, but they're focused on the individual, right? They say, no, the collective does not take priority over the individual here. So this is where you're dealing with people like Ayn Rand and Nietzsche. Now, personally, the problem with either of these philosophies is that the morality that emerges from them is nothing like the morality when people talk about morality generally. Okay. Yes, there's an objective moral standard. You can do it.
And that honestly that's the whole
point
I'm bringing up.
More people will benefit from the enslaving of this small group of individuals, and therefore we enslave the small group for the greater good, right? We always talk about the greater good. Or
so I'm not trying to get in. I'm honestly not trying to get into the details of if you have that standard without God, what does that standard look like? I just want you to acknowledge, which you basically have, that from now on in future conversations, atheist morality isn't something that's like an oxymoron.
No, okay, let me put it this way. Atheist morality is an oxymoron if by morality you mean a morality that is anything close to what Christians are talking about.
So do you think that those thinkers that you listed, or even people like Sam Harris, that you just think that they're completely irrational, or do you think that?
Yes, they're still holding on. They're holding on to Christian assumptions and from the Christian culture in which they exist, that has, as you talked about, it has formulated their conscience. The problem with this whole idea of, you're talking about your conscience is there no matter what, your conscience is enormously molded.
No, I agree with that, but I think it's, and maybe this is probably one of the videos we'll look at, but making the claim that our conscience is completely tied to Christian morality, and if we get rid of that, then the conscience is going to become off the rails, and who knows what it'll develop into. I don't know if I'm going to be able to follow that line of thinking, but
that was exactly what Nietzsche said.
But what I'm trying to get at is, these are all good conversations to have. What is our conscience going to do? No one really, like, if you shut down the debate at atheists shouldn't be talking about morality, that cuts out if we assume this premise is true, then let's explore those ideas and see where they go.
No, that's fine. I mean, I fair enough. Like, let atheists have their conversation about their moral framework. My thing is that you actually can logically take some of these to their logical conclusions. And
I've heard you do it a lot. And the thing that I think you keep missing is how hard it is to draw that divide that you draw between individualism and collectivism. That divide is very hard. And in one of your videos, you actually had mentioned, like, it was actually in your morality video, like, a mother will sacrifice herself for her offspring, even though it might not make perfect sense, but would she rather live knowing that she didn't do that or die knowing that she did? So, like, the collective well-being and your well-being in some way is related. We can debate on how. Sure. And yeah, I've heard you can see that point. But in order to draw this individualism will lead to you doing all these bad things, that is hard because your individual well-being is dependent on the group, and the group's well-being is dependent on yours.
There is to some extent a connection there. There's no doubt about it. But the problem is that line in particular is one that is as I explore it, most of the conscience that you talk about, that any one of us in modern Western society have, is deeply rooted in the influence of Judeo-Christian ethics over a very long period of time. And one of the things that happens is that if you get outside of that Judeo-Christian ethic, what you find is that in other societies, very different consciences exist. And so if a conscience is nothing more than the product of social and evolutionary forces, it's just arbitrary. So what you feel as well-being is ultimately the arbitrary product of natural forces, and it isn't actually anything inherent. It's just as arbitrary as anything else that exists in the universe. And so what emerges we can talk about, well-being that exists, but it's like the universe doesn't exist for the well-being of human beings. Like in my context, like it does. Like that's the reason all this exists is so that human beings can exist and that we can progress and all that kind of stuff. That's our theology. But if you take that away, what is the alternative? The alternative is that it's all arbitrary, right? And ultimately,
I agree. It's arbitrary in a sense. It's arbitrary in like, maybe you could say like it's ultimately arbitrary, but like acting for your own well-being, is that arbitrary? It's like, yeah, it's arbitrary, but the purpose of it is to make you feel better.
Yeah, and that is ultimately the purpose of all actions. And that's the part of it that I guess is not arbitrary, is that you are a creature that is designed to seek your own well-being. Yeah, like the ungrounded part that would make it arbitrary is well-being. It's like you can't ground well-being. It's just what you are as a person is a thing that wants to not suffer. Yeah, but the thing is, so you don't really need a justification for the well-being piece. It's just is the reality. Well-being is the justification. It's like, that's the way that is the standard of which the word justification, by the way, this is an interesting little side note, is justification. If you're measuring something, they'll say you need to justify your lines, right? Or you need to true up your lines. You need to align it with something else, right? And like the thing that we're all trying to align ourselves with is with this idea of well-being. Well, the idea from sort of the religious side of the equation, from my side of the equation, is that we're saying that in the cosmos itself, which was designed with a purpose, there are actual laws that govern the well-being of human beings now and into eternity. And they're not arbitrary. They exist for a purpose, and they're unchanging eternal laws that govern it. Where from a materialist perspective, my take on kind of where the logical conclusion would be is that the laws that govern well-being are contingent upon just the forces that exist. And you may actually, in Roman society, have a higher level of well-being and a satisfied conscience by going in, raping and murdering and pillaging the bad guys, because that's what you do as a Roman. Or not even the bad guys. We could just say the smaller, weaker tribe that you guys came upon who doesn't want to submit to Roman rule. And so it's all socially contingent. And so your well-being, rather than being connected to fixed and eternal principles, is actually something that's socially conditioned and arbitrary based on the time that you're living in.
And we knew this was going to happen. Like, I kind of want to get on to the next one, but this eternal thing, or like eternal laws and principles that aren't contingent, that leads you into deontology type of realm where I could push you all day long and get you to budge on these eternal principles. And I don't think that these are going to be these universal laws that always exist. I think there's a lot of situational ethics that's going to come into play.
My entire video series, I hope that people get out of it that I embrace situational ethics as the actual way that God has things designed, but there are principles that get applied to those situations, and the principles don't change, but the context in which they need to be applied can change, and so the behavior can change.
One of my takeaways from your videos is basically the whole thing up until your definition of ultimate well-being is the afterlife, and that causes a lot of downstream effects and how you orient yourself. Every piece of that framework can be applied to an atheist up until that point.
And in large part, I'm thinking about this in detail to see if I'll regret saying it, but I'm gonna cautiously concede and say yes. I can totally see where someone comes up with that, and I agree. The thing is that last part that we're talking about is enormous. It changes the whole thing. So the morality that exists is not. I mean, it's like saying, well, in my morality, we torture children and puppies for fun, and like. That's that's not morality as I see it. It's so immoral.
So my whole point of this one example that I brought up in this clip is to open up the idea that atheists can rationally talk about morality. How that plays out, where the logical conclusions get you, that's one thing. But it doesn't mean inherently you are becoming not an atheist anymore because you have some objective standard.
Yeah, I do believe, and I think Sam Harris provides a very good framework where atheists can talk about morality in an objective sense. My caveat to that, and the reason you might still hear me say atheists talking about morality seems silly, is because the morality that emerges is arbitrary. It is a socially contingent on the laws of nature sort of thing. And it is what it is, where the morality and it's totally changeable depending on the social conditions. Whereas ours is something that is based on fixed and immutable principles of truth that are from whence it emerges. But yes, within the framework of that sort of well-being as socially conditioned, in that sense, yes, they can talk about morality. It just isn't the morality that I'm talking about, and I think that most people are.
Yeah, and that's fine. I just mostly want to start to push this idea that there is a good conversation to be had there and explored.
Yeah. All right.
I'm down to move on to the second one.
Let's go on to the next clip here.
You have it pulled up.
Yeah. What episode? Just tell me what episode and like what part.
Episode 3.
Okay.
Sorry, episode 2.
Okay.
1 minute, 38 seconds.
All right, let me pull it up here. You said it is an episode. Oops. Let me pull it up here.
I think it's episode 2. It might be episode 3. We'll see.
It's episode 2, you said?
We'll see. I'm pretty sure it is.
Episode 2. And what is the time frame on it?
138.
138. Oh, right in the beginning of it. Look at that. Here we go. Open up this thing all the way. And one objection people may have is that suffering and well-being are experienced subjectively. If by this they mean that suffering is a matter of perception, then yes, I agree. However, all of reality is ultimately a matter of subjective perception. Does this mean that all of reality itself is entirely subjective? Of course not. All perception is by definition subjective. But the question is if that perception is purely the creation of the mind, or if it is a reflection of an objective reality outside of the mind. On the other hand, if I say I like green, and you say that you like blue, these are not a description of a reality outside of one's head. They are merely statements of subjective preference. This is a critical distinction. Subjective perception is the way that we subjectively interpret a reality that exists outside of ourselves, which may or may not be accurate. However, subjective preference is purely a mental construct without a right or wrong answer, because it is not a description of anything in objective reality. To say that suffering is perceived by a subject is just to state the obvious. Okay. I almost want to continue playing it because I think this next part is very critical.
Oh, that's fine. You can.
Let's continue playing this a little bit further. There is a deeper question. Is suffering merely a matter of subjective preference, or is it part of our existence with the rich, multi-layered reality that we inhabit? Suffering and its opposite are arguably the most real thing that exists. Okay, I just wanted to have that last point there kind of made. So go ahead and perhaps kind of steel man what I was saying before you jump into the critique.
The funny thing is, after I've just, in my opinion, scored a win for atheism, objective morality, I'm actually going to disagree with it. And I just think that it's actually not objective. But so to steel man, you're saying there's subjective and objective. Objective, by its very nature, is talking about something that exists outside of the mind. And subjective is something that is in the mind, although there's kind of this gray area of like, we interpret everything through the mind. So even though something may go through the mind, the fact that it's rooted in something outside of it, that's what makes it objective. Something like that.
I'm gonna go back to this little part of the video and actually have you take a look at it as we discuss it. This is super important. Believe me, this is one of those areas. When I made this video, I spent like several days or more trying to look up everything I could on the nature of the subjective versus the objective. And it's actually like linguistically, there's all sorts of bull crap, and it's hard to figure out what people are even talking about.
Yeah, and thinking about it, it's one of those things where it's like when you repeat a word over and over and it starts to like lose its meaning. It's like, wait a minute, why are we even talking about this? I can't remember. Yes,
and the whole subjective versus objective is one of these areas we get. I know in our family conversations, it's always a sticking point that we get down to. But what I've come to figure out is I think it's mainly due to a linguistic problem where we don't distinguish between this. Are we talking about a subjective preference, or are we talking about a subjective perception of an objective reality, right?
So I think I'm still confused by, I think these are also confusing words, but I think I found, and let's see if you agree with me, a way, kind of like a litmus test that I think can help solve this. Okay, and it's basically, can it, in theory, be solved by a third-party arbitrator? That would be an objective thing, something that can get, there is some way of measuring this. There is some way that if we're having a dispute, there is a third party that could say, no, Forrest is right here.
I'm gonna tentatively agree, but I think that it's one of those ones that I'm kind of like,
You're like, where are the holes? There might be some holes somewhere.
Yeah. So
that's how I think it, because I think that's actually what is. I'm kind of at like, why do we care about objective versus subjective?
Because if we go back here to this idea, it's one thing for me to say that I like the color green. It's another thing for me to say that the paper in the other room is green, right? One is a statement about preference. Another is a statement about perception. One of them is literally just like, there's no right or wrong answer to, green. Is green the best color? You know what I mean? There is a right or wrong answer to matters of perception. I could be shown that my perception, or be given good reasons to believe that my perception is actually incorrect, right? And those who are kind of the hardcore sort of quote unquote subjectivist types say everything is just a matter of subjective. It's all subjective, and by that they mean it's all like subjective preference. It's all just, there is no right or wrong answers to things. So in matters of morality, is morality ultimately just matters of subjective preference? Like, I like torturing dogs. You don't. There's no right or wrong answer, right? But if we're dealing with suffering, meaning our own suffering, while it is a matter of perception, it is, it's not just a matter of preference. Nobody prefers to suffer, because that would literally, suffering by definition is the thing that you don't prefer. If you preferred it, then it would not be suffering by definition, right? It's literally a linguistic sort of oxymoron. So if someone is suffering, that means they are experiencing the thing that they don't prefer. It's an objective thing that's happening, right? What's causing it, all that's all secondary. But I want to very clearly make a distinction. Whenever someone talks about subjective, if they mention the word subjective, I just ask, are they talking about a subjective preference or a subjective perception? Because everything we perceive is filtered through us. Everything is a matter of subjective perception. That's why we could be living in the matrix.
So this is something I brought up in one of my videos is, and I think it's a good analogy, but I'm not sure where you stand on it. Is taste a subjective preference or a subjective perception?
I would say that taste is something that affects our level of well-being or suffering. If something increases our well-being when we eat it, then that would be, we would call that, good. Like, objectively, this is something that increases my well-being. Therefore, it's objective in that sense, right? Now, so I would, on that level, I would say that it's objective to the degree that I suffer or I don't.
Oh, sorry, now, is it a perception or
it's a perception. Preference. It's a faculty
it's a
of
preference
perception.
Or a perception.
All sense data is an experience of perception. Like, I literally look at with my eyeballs and I
is
see
there
something.
A right or wrong answer to whether shrimp tastes better than a burrito?
Yes. For me.
Yeah.
In my conscious experience.
Yeah, but is there a right or wrong answer to you like green more than red?
It is no. What I'm saying when I say I like green more than red is I would say that green is something that provides me with a higher level of well-being than red does. Something like that.
Yeah, so then, like, I think this distinction that you have is, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because I like green. Is that objectively true that you like green?
Is it objectively true? Yes.
So But this is why like your analogy is kind of confusing me. I think the better way to look at it is, could a third party arbitrator actually answer these without being in your head?
Well, the thing is that technically everything is in my head. That's
So your example of a green paper in the other room. If you said there's not a green paper in the other room, could that person go and say, "No, Jacob, you're wrong. There is a paper in the other room and it's green"?
Yes, that person could.
Like that's what I'm trying to describe, and I think I believe that's what most people are describing when they say objective and subjective.
Yeah, no, obviously it is. There are, and maybe linguistically or whatever, this is just challenging to kind of sort through mentally because I'm thinking through it in my head right now.
No, it is for sure.
It's one of those ones that's bending the mind a little bit. If you have a subjective, right now, these two things that we're looking at on the screen, subjective preference and subjective perception, these are both matters of subjective. They both fall under the terminology of the subjective. Okay. The objective is the thing outside of ourself, right? The thing outside of our mind entirely, the green piece of paper in the other room. Okay. The difference is that one is a perception of an objective reality. The other is just merely an arbitrary taste that we have.
Well, so I would 100% put I like shrimp under subjective preference, according to this breakdown.
So yes, and yes, I like shrimp is a subjective preference, but the reason a person would say that is because of an objective phenomena that they have when interacting with shrimp. That it
but then
their well-being.
So this, I mean, I do agree that you could actually take this to a fun place of like, everything is objective at the end of the day, because in theory, if we knew the mind well enough, you could literally measure all of this. Mm-hmm. And I don't need to talk to you anymore. I could literally say, I know you like shrimp because I ran the AI on your brain, and it says Jacob likes shrimps because these neurons fired. Like, so that exists. But besides going into that world, the only way I can know what's going to bring you well-being is to be in your head experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, I can see how that would be, but I would also say that there are patterns of well-being that exist, and so it does not seem that well-being is something that is like, there are factors that determine if something produces well-being. If I go have 100 people touch a stove, 100 people will say I suffered when I touched the stove. Therefore, in the reality that exists, there seems to be some sort of a law that says if you touch stove, that creates suffering.
Yeah, so, and this is where I agree. So I think this is all subjective, but I think that we all operate under kind of a spectrum of reality almost that will have us acting in similar ways. For example, I believe taste is totally subjective, but I have a pretty good chance.
Now, when you say subjective, do you mean taste is a totally subjective preference or a subjective perception?
Yes. Well, I don't like any of these, but I would say it's a preference. Like, we can use this exact model, and I would say, I'll use the food one and then I'll go to colors because I think I could do it with colors too. But I would say Jacob probably likes to eat food that tastes good. Therefore, you ought not eat dog poo. I don't know. I just am pretty dang sure that you're not going to find, even though I think it's completely subjective, there's patterns in life that we can use to use kind of this moral language, even if it's subjective.
See, the thing is that's my whole point. That's what I'm driving at here. What you're saying is that you're talking about a subjective perception of an objective reality. The objective reality is that there is some sort of a law in the universe that says eating dog poop is going to harm you.
Okay, but what law is there that says I like shrimp, but you don't?
I would put that on in the area of what I consider in my framework a morally like a moral gray area, an area of moral neutrality. It's an area that doesn't really affect your well-being one way or the other. And somebody might, get, maybe they like shrimp more, maybe they like,
No, but if taste is objective, then we should have an answer to that. Like, no, Jacob, you're wrong. Shrimp is actually delicious, no matter how you feel about it.
You could say that given your constitution, and even on the materialist side, you could do this. You could say, Forrest, given your constitution of the way that your neurons and everything are built in your body and your brain, eating shrimp will cause you immense pleasure. We've done the calculations.
Yeah, right? But that's what I'm saying is, aside from that case, because if you want to say that that case, in my opinion, takes away subjective anything. There's no such thing as subjective at that point. That's just pure determinism, and we actually could figure everything out, and there's no such thing as subjectivity. But the way we typically refer to subjective is we all have different preferences, and because of those different preferences, you may like to enslave and murder people, and I may not like to do that. And who is right, we don't actually know.
And I would say, yeah, if it is ultimately arbitrary and socially conditioned, then in Rome, you might have been your well-being, because of the constitution that happened to you and the creation of you through the social conditioning of your environment, which is very much what kind of Foucault talks about, is that, and even Nietzsche, that there is a morality that is created by your society that you're in, and that you will experience well-being by conforming basically to the social norms of the herd that you're a part of. What I'm saying is that no, there are actual right and wrong moral answers to moral questions, regardless of the herd that you're in, because we're not just animals, and there's actual accountability for this stuff in an eternal timescale.
But this is, I think, the dilemma that you're going to run into. That's the hard part, is you can have the world set up the exact same way and insert two different people. And if well-being is your standard, their answers to those questions are actually, or the moral answer to the dilemma that they're in could be different for different people. If well-being is your standard.
To a certain extent, I agree with that. And I think that's part of the point of my video.
So that's what makes things subjective. That's the problem of subjectivity, is now it's like, wow, you can't say, hey, if you're in this dilemma, no doing this.
I wouldn't say subjective. I would say situationally based.
No, I'm saying the situation is the same. We're taking situational ethics out of it. We're saying Jacob and Forrest are in the same position, and there could be different answers to what the morally right choice is, because we have different preferences and different things that'll bring us more well-being.
Well, I would think that there might be areas that are more morally ambiguous, but I can't see a scenario where if you put two different people in the same place and say, "Hey guys, touch the stove," and that there's, in some world, one of them is going to be like, "Yay, this is wonderful. I feel great now that my hand is burning." And so I think there are scenarios.
So I mean, I can come up with good examples of, like, Jacob, you have to either run 50 miles or bike 200 miles. What's going to bring you more suffering?
For me, it would be probably running.
I'll pick whatever the opposite is. And I could say, for me, biking would bring me more suffering.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm not saying that every single that in a morally like that's the thing. Some things are in what I call the range of moral ambiguity. Like, they don't really, like, it's sort of like, is pasta going to bring you greater well-being, or will pizza? And it's like, you like both of them.
So I understand the moral ambiguity, because I pushed you on it a couple of times of, like, yeah, under this framework, technically every decision you make is a moral decision.
Yes.
But this is where it's not just moral ambiguity. There's, like, serious issue, the classic, like, trolley problem. you can get serious issues and have people come at this from different angles, and that everyone's confused and everyone has different feelings about it. The trolley problem where would you push somebody in front of the train in order to stop it from hitting? If two people are tied down on the tracks, let's say, and there's one person, if you shove him in front of the train will actually stop and you'll save those two people. Like, is that a morally ambiguous, as it kind of like insignificant thing? It's like, that is an extremely morally challenging situation. And what is going to bring the actor, the person that's either pushing or not pushing, better well-being is going to change from person to person. Like, you may be able to live with the fact that you saved two people by shoving someone.
I would say it's even more complicated than that. It really has more to do with the nature of being itself. And that's where the real kind of, in my opinion, that's where the crux of the issue is. The problem with morality is not even our own, I guess it is to some degree our constitutions of who we are and what we're made up of, but it goes into the realm of metaphysics, into what is ultimate reality, what is being itself, what is the nature of being, will I exist now or forever, and what are the different laws? And that's a conversation that ultimately, as I see it, that's where the answers are actually found. Because like you're saying, if everything, like there's an AI that could determine everything, then we could figure out the exact right answer to every single moral question, hypothetically, with perfect precision, because we have this perfect AI kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? So, but so metaphysics, the nature of being itself, the nature of reality itself, that's where the actual disagreement is. And so the problem is that, like the trolley question, let's use that as an example. If I'm going to push the guy in front of it, and he dies, but then it saves the others, well, in a sort of cosmic picture, there could be right and wrong answers to those questions. And there could be right and wrong questions to those if reality is only, you only exist for 80 years. And so that's the situation. We talk about the situational ethics. The problem is we don't actually understand the nature of the situation because we don't have the full picture of like the big picture of the situation. Because the situation changes if it's like, oh yeah, by the way, in this equation of the trolley, Allah is God. And Allah has said that if you kill someone, he'll burn you in hell forever. And so now you're like, okay, I won't push the guy.
Yeah. So, you know what I mean? And I guess let's just say there is we're just in an atheist framework. The atheist has the issue of, you could have people that have different well-being with different answers.
Yep.
Like, I can live with myself all day long. I'd be happy, let's say, in theory, if I push that guy, but I save two others, I could live with that. Where other people, their lives may be ruined and they kill themselves because they couldn't live with that decision.
And it's very much based on how much of that is based on the social conditioning of the person, and how much of that is just based on the arbitrary power dynamics of the society that they grew up in, and who was the victor, who was able to preach their version of morality to the people. So it's all complicated, and obviously we're getting kind of towards the end here. Yeah, so I'll kind of give you the final word here as we wrap up.
So the two things I brought up was, I think that atheists can talk about morality in logical ways, whether that's using well-being as a framework, or what I've talked about in the past, similar to, we can kind of make assumptions based off of how we've seen patterns in the universe, kind of like the taste example, where like I can pretty likely, or with a high degree of confidence, say you ought not eat dirt, because I'm assuming that you want well-being. I'm assuming you want to eat something that tastes good. So even without this objective standard, the way my moral framework works is I make one assumption, and that assumption is that you want well-being. And then I think at that point, it's basically becomes an objective standard. Or yeah, not exactly, but we can get into that in a different clip.
Cool.
Yeah, those are my two thoughts on your morality video.
Well, I appreciate the feedback, and right on. We'll catch you all in the next episode. Take care.
Cool. Thanks.
Hey, if you enjoyed this episode and want to try to improve your engagement with those you disagree with, I want to share with you a few of the principles that Forrest and I try to abide in these conversations. First, we try to steelman each other's perspective before offering a critique. We make sure that the other person feels that we have not misrepresented their point of view. When you are not addressing the actual argument the other person is making, you just end up talking past each other. Second, we seek clarity, not consensus. We are trying to understand the nature of our disagreement and clarify the distinctions between our different points of view by comparing and contrasting the different ways we justify our position. Instead of the discussion being about winning an argument, it's about two people curiously exploring how they arrived at their different conclusions. And third, just things as simple as defining your terms can do immense good in conversation. So often people talk past each other simply because the words they are using are vague or can mean different things to different people. Much conflict comes not because of disagreement, but simply because of confused language and misunderstanding. In the end, our shared goal in these discussions is not just to engage with each other on a variety of topics, but hopefully to model how people with wildly different opinions can engage meaningfully. Do we always succeed? Of course not. But we hope that to some extent, we can be part of the solution in bridging the gaps between people of different opinions.